If you're having customers and clients that are feeling the impact of this issue, and if you're feeling it, I mean, if it's stressing you out, if it's something that you're putting off because you don't want to deal with it because it stresses you, then you bring someone in because that's impacting your productivity, it's impacting your mental health, it's impacting your well-being. Then that's the time that you bring in help, right? You bring in reinforcement, somebody who knows what they're doing and can sort this out for you and probably take a huge load off of your shoulders in a relatively short period of time because they know what they're doing.
Welcome to the People Powered Solutions podcast. In this show, you'll gain expert advice and tips on building a thriving workplace culture with happy employees. I'm your host, Lorianne Duguay, and I'm thrilled to be spending this time with you today. Hello, and welcome to another episode of People Powered Podcast. Folks, today we're talking something that not a lot of people enjoy talking about, but everyone has to contend with. We're talking about conflict in the workplace. We're moving away a bit from our series of showcasing companies that are doing culture really, really well, and decided to kind of add someone who is going to be able to support and give you tips on how to not only manage conflict, but how to embrace it, encourage it, and to help you understand that stop avoiding it, start managing it. Today, we welcome Mandi Clay. Hello, Mandi. Well, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
We're a breed of our own. I'm also excited we get to talk about conflict, where most people want to run the other way as soon as there is any level of conflict. So, Mandi, before we get started, could you please share with our audience how Mandi got to doing what Mandi does today?
All right, sure. So I am an attorney by trade. I have been an attorney for 17 years now. I actually started with a degree in criminal justice undergrad and then went to law school at the University of Georgia. And I started out working for a federal judge. So I got to sort of see the law from behind the bench. And that's kind of how I started out my career as a lawyer. I practiced for about 15 years as a litigator, and I was representing businesses and individuals. I did both sides of the line, plaintiff and defendant. I did commercial litigation. I did a lot of employment law, contract disputes. I did, discrimination stuff, wage and hour things, a lot of that. Of course, when you're doing employment law, you're getting down and dirty with the employers, right? You're going into the businesses, you're working with the employees, you're doing trainings, you're trying to resolve things before they get to court. You're trying to resolve things once they're in court. So I'm sort of in all of that. Eventually, I ended up going out on my own and litigating on my own for a while, and then I became a mediator. And so that's what I do now. I try to focus mostly on mediations, do some arbitrations as well, which is where I'm the decision maker. I work for a company called Miles Mediation and Arbitration, and we do just what we say, mediations and arbitrations. We have a workplace division that works with large employers to resolve conflict within the workplace. So we do that as well. And then we also do mediations and arbitrations of all kinds of disputes outside of the workplace.
Outside of the world of work. Awesome. You know what I find really interesting is that we've had a similar path, except you followed through. So what I mean by that, no, I'll explain this. I started my undergrad law. I wanted to be a lawyer. Mm-hmm. And through our very first case studies, something didn't sit right with me. This notion of, doing this digging and trying to research and find basically your opponent's weakest link and holes in their story, and then kind of targeting that just didn't sit well with me. And I remember having a conversation with my mom, who was also a dispute resolution practitioner, a mediator, and saying, tell me a bit more about this mediation thing. And what is it about compared to litigation? And I remember her saying, It's about where litigation is very oppositional. We're kind of going, it's one pinning against the other. Mediation is about teaching. It's about educating people on how to work together towards these common interests, to identify these common interests, and then to come up with some resolution that isn't a compromise, but rather is really win-win for both of them. And they're both walking away feeling confident because they both had a hand in that resolution. And I was like, okay, that sits so much better with me. And that's when, way back when, in the 99s area, I switched my major, my
The
undergrad.
late 1900s.
Yeah, late 19, my kids still say that, like, you were around in the 1900s, Mom? I'm like, oh my God, do not say it that way. It makes me feel really old. But yeah, I switched my major and I went, and while I was still completing my undergrad, I went and did my mediation courses, my certifications. And initially, this is where the naive 19-year-old started my own mediation practice, all the while finishing my undergrad. And so didn't really get really busy because, seriously, who wants to go to a 19-year-old to help them solve their divorce or their separation agreement? Like, I have no idea what my mom was thinking by allowing me. Maybe she was just fully supportive. But anyways, all that to say, later in life, as I started consulting, some of my first projects ended up being conflict resolution in the workplace, ended up, coming into these organizations and first kind of doing a bit of an assessment, a deep dive into what might be at play in terms of recurring conflict happening within different teams, and then helping them develop the systems that would help them address that conflict and manage it on the regular, as well as training their people to own their working relationships and to own their conflict. So I think it's interesting that we've had some very similar paths. And I like that you've also landed with mediation. I mean, by all means, litigation, it has its purpose in life, absolutely. But for me, my first love was definitely the mediation piece.
Yeah.
So for those who are listening and might not really understand the nuance between like what mediation is about, do you want to just talk a bit more, just very generally, what is mediation and how can it serve in the workplace?
Yeah. So, mediation is basically when the parties get to put the resolution of the conflict in their own hands, right? So they get to work out a resolution amongst themselves with the help of the mediator. So the mediator comes in as a neutral third party. Generally it's a confidential process. So, I talk about being in a mediation bubble. We talk about, kind of like whatever happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, except we actually mean it, right? There's no cell phone videos. There's no photos posted on Facebook, right? Everything stays in the mediation bubble.
I'm writing that one down because I like it. And I'm not stealing it. I'm just going to borrow it if you're okay with that.
That's fine. There's no copyright. And so we talk about trying to find a resolution amongst the parties that we can reach. And a lot of times, I mean, whether you're talking about in a workplace or you're talking about in a courtroom, the parties have the power to think of resolutions that the regular decision makers often either don't have the power to come up with or don't even think about, right? It's not within their realm because they're not sitting in the seat of the people that are in the conflict. And they don't necessarily have the empathy or the understanding to meet you where you are because they haven't been where you are. And so for me, I think mediation is hugely about empathy. And I am a student of empathy. I don't think empathy is something that you're born with or not. I think it is something that can be learned and developed and really bred in a person. And so it's something that I've worked on my entire life, really purposefully, really since I was a teenager, honestly. You know, I remember when I was very young, my mom had a friend who died from cancer, and I remember feeling like I didn't fully understand the pain that my mother was going through when her best friend died from cancer. And I tried very hard to do everything I could to like show my mother that I cared, even though I knew that I couldn't fully understand it, right?
Hmm.
And so ever since then, I've tried very hard in my life to do everything I can to develop empathy and to put myself in the place of the people that I'm working with. And I think that's a mediator's job. I
Yeah.
think first and foremost is to talk to the people that you're working with and talk to these two parties and figure out what they're really feeling.
Yeah.
Not just look at the details of the conflict, but to really see what emotions are there and to find out what is going to make these people feel like they've been heard
Yeah.
and get them to a resolution that allows them to move forward.
Absolutely. And I like that you said what they're really feeling, because in my experience, I'm not sure if this has been your experience as well. I suspect it has. They'll come in and they'll say one thing, like you never, for example, if it's a separation, they're trying to like kind of negotiate the terms of what that new normal will be afterwards. And they come in saying, you never respect the time, you bring the kids back too late on a Sunday night. And I told you it's supposed to be 7 and you bring them back at 9. And then before they answer, so what I'm hearing is, right, and that's our go-to line as a mediator,
Right.
so what I'm hearing is, because we're that diffuser between the two, we're there to diffuse and neutralize and
Yeah.
add that level of objectivity to the statement, but also at the same time to help them recognize what they're really saying.
Right.
They're saying that, but it sounds like I'm hearing that you feel like you're missing out on quality time with your kids because they're bringing them home too late. Yeah, exactly. That's what I said. It's not really what you said, but it's okay. We've just went and neutralized that and then flipping that back to the other. Okay, so what would you like to respond to that, right? And helping them kind of, you're facilitating that conversation by removing and diffusing and neutralizing the statements being said, because it is a heavy, depending on the nature of the conflict, it can be a heavy emotional experience. So our role is to really, to your point, help you recognize the emotion at play, and then help you say and state what you need to feel heard and to really feel like the other person is not just listening, they're hearing you, because there's
Yes.
a difference between the two, right?
Yeah.
I love
And in the workplace, it's so much heavier because there are different people approach workplaces differently, right? Some people try to shield themselves in the workplace to really separate the personal from the professional. Some people bring their whole selves into the workplace. There are different levels, there's a spectrum in between those two things. And so you have to sort of first of all understand when you're dealing with people in the workplace, are they showing you their whole selves or not? Are they showing their coworkers their whole selves or not? So you have to understand that. And I one of the most profound experiences I ever had was helping a work group after an employee had been fired for harassing another employee. So there was a sexual harassment incident that occurred, and the harasser was terminated. And it upset the morale of the entire group. And so the management brought me in to not only to sort of go through your typical PowerPoint of this is what harassment is and all of that, but to also work with the group. And there was a racial component in that harassment as well. And that actually was more powerful than the sexual component of the harassment in the group that was left behind, because that was the thing that was more difficult to talk about. It was easier to talk about, okay, this is what men shouldn't do to women, than it was to talk about the racial aspect, right? It is still very difficult in our country to talk about
Mhm.
racial issues. We ended up having a very open and honest conversation about why the Black female victim had several layers of, I guess, defense mechanisms up that the white men in the room were unaware of,
Okay.
right? And she carried those defense mechanisms with her everywhere she went. And the men in the room, particularly the white men in the room, were not aware of these defense mechanisms. I had to help her explain those to them and help them understand them. And there really wasn't as much, I guess, aggression as she was feeling. There was just a lot of misunderstanding.
Mm.
And so once we got things out in the open and once people understood and could empathize and see things from other people's point of views and could learn the correct words to use and could learn how to say what they were really feeling and have a safe space, we were able to really get some improved morale in this group that probably would never have happened if you didn't have somebody else come in and make a safe space for these people to say these things.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. Because that safe space, that neutral, that objective third party are coming in, and there's kind of this unspoken knowing that they don't have a history. They are unaware. Like, even when I'm doing any investigations or some needs assessment within an organization, I only ask the information that I need relevant to that. I don't want to hear the stories that go all the way back that you can't confirm and you can't validate, right? Like, it's really important to approach that conversation through that neutral lens. And when you bring in a neutral third party, I feel that it really, in and of itself, provides that safe space. People are that much more honest and authentic when they're speaking to someone who they don't feel, one, there could be repercussions in the workplace afterwards if they speak the truth, or two, that they may have had a history at one point that has impacted their level of trust with that individual. So you might be in a leadership position and you think you're doing a good thing by not kind of bringing someone in neutral, but trying to manage it yourself. But there's value to, if it's been going on for long enough, to bring someone neutral in. So definitely, I guess, tip number one, if you've had this recurring conflict happening within your workplace, you're seeing these patterns, consider bringing in someone completely neutral, like a mediator, to be able to do a bit of a deeper dive and figure out what might actually be at play, what the roots of that reoccurring conflict may actually be. And then they can also provide recommendations and training to be able to build the infrastructure required to manage it on the longer term. Yes. So we talked, and you touched on how this, in this particular scenario, once they understood the words they needed, that must have been a very kind of courageous conversation to facilitate. And so I guess tip number two from that is to provide the training to your team members to facilitate and to make them that much more confident, because we avoid what we don't know how to tackle. So if you're able to provide them with the skills and normalize that conflict is unavoidable. So let's give you the tools, the skills, and the training you need to be able to manage those conversations. Then they'll be that much more apt to have the conversations. The last point I wanted to make, just all relevant to this beautiful story you just shared, is that it is in fact unavoidable. So people need to really realize that you're conflicted with yourself sometimes. Your head's saying one thing, your heart's saying another. Well, guess what? The minute you multiply perspectives, the likelihood of conflict is that much higher. Now let's bring in the workplace, where people have competing priorities, where some people are people-oriented, other people are task-oriented. Let's be honest, folks. Conflict is going to happen, right? And you mentioned how there was misunderstanding. I would say the root of most conflict lies in misunderstanding, misconceptions, and unmet expectations that may or may never have been communicated.
Right.
Right?
Right.
Okay, so if we've realized and we've put it out there, Mandi, people need to embrace conflict. If conflict has been reoccurring for too long, they need to think and consider bringing someone in to help kind of neutralize, but also to help dig a bit deeper with a very structured methodology. Now, let's just talk about, as a leader within an organization, what are some of the things they can do to help facilitate some of those initial conversations when you're feeling tension come up, you're feeling conflict happening? What are some tips that you provide to leaders to be able to help equip them to manage some of those conversations?
First of all, I think it's important to have conversations, first of all, one-on-one. You need to have a safe space, like we talked about. You need to be able to have a conversation with if you have a conflict between two or more people in the workplace that you're trying to manage or mediate on your own without a professional, which sometimes has to be done to get through things, I think it's important to have the conversations one-on-one. And then once you've sort of dug into what's going on, I think it's important to bring the parties together with you and have a conversation globally. A lot of times people want to avoid that global conversation because this person doesn't want to talk to that person. But the reality is that they're going to have to work together unless it's so bad that you're going to terminate one or you really are going to separate them. If they're going to have to continue to work together, you need to have that global conversation. So once you dug into the story with one person and you dug into it with the other and you've sort of realized what's underlying both and you've had a conversation with both and you've dug into it with both of them and you've given your neutral assessment with both of them, I think it's a good idea to bring them both together in a safe space and say to them, look, this is going to be confidential. We want to keep this all in this room, but we want to have a safe and open conversation here and talk about how we can move this forward. And make sure that, do what a mediator would do. Bring them together and try to come to some sort of resolution where not everybody's going to be 100% happy. Not everybody's going to get 100% of what they want. That's not how mediations work, right? Everybody has to give a little to get a little, but everybody gets to be heard and everybody gets to express what they really are feeling and what they really believe needs to happen. And I think that has to happen. I think we try to avoid that confrontation, but it doesn't have to be a confrontation if you prepare the parties individually and then bring them together.
Like prepare them. I think that's kind of an addition that I would add to what you've just explained is explain the process to both parties, right? Explain to them, I'm having a meeting with you first so that you can give me a bit more insight into what might be at play here. And then I'm going to do the same thing with this other person. Then I'm going to bring you guys together and we're going to have a conversation where you're going to share with each other what you believe has brought us to where we are today. So through that exercise, you're going to have the opportunity to feel and be completely heard. Mm-hmm. Once we're done that, what we need to understand is we are signing up and are committed to figuring out what needs to happen for us to move forward, for us to turn the page and never come back. And let's be really clear that, and one of the things I always tell them is, let's be very clear that once we've both been completely heard, we really have to commit to leaving it exactly where it is. This has been managed. This has been dealt with. We've been heard. Now we're starting with a blank slate. And then from there, we get to these shared commitments. What do you need from this other person in order to be able to work? Because I always start with, once they've both been heard, I tell them, okay, what would the ideal state of your working relationship look like? Describe it to me. And they both describe it to me and okay, perfect. And what needs to happen for us to get there? I'll sometimes say, like, to get them started, want you to say 3 things you need from that other person, 3 things. Then actually, as a manager, you're able to craft kind of an agreement of sorts. This is what we've both committed to. Have them both, write it all out, what they both agreed to, and everybody sign it. But within that agreement, the piece that's often missed is, what are we going to do if someone doesn't uphold one of these things? What's our recourse? What are the steps we're going to take to escalate or to address future conflict and have it all captured in there? Then you've got this wonderful tool to use if it does come back to say, hey guys, just want to put this out there, right? And then you've got how to manage it in that moment. You've already determined the steps. Not sure if that's kind of the process that you follow with your mediations as well.
Well, lawyers, we love putting things in writing, right? So as much as you can put in writing, the better, right? So you have a record, and so you can go back to, this is what we said. This is, we were all in the room. We signed this document. So of course, as much as you can outline in writing, the better. So yes, absolutely.
Absolutely. There's something you said earlier, and I wanted to visit it again when you were talking about when you talked about, obviously there are some conflicts that should absolutely be mediated by a professional.
Mhm.
While as a leader, you're going to have to manage some tension within the team. Could you maybe highlight when to call a mediator versus a mediator? Wow, a mediator versus when the expectation is that you need to manage that as a manager. That's something that you need to get involved. And let's add a third one where, as a leader, when do you actually flip it back to the people, the parties at play, and say, what do you need to have this conversation? How can I support you in having that conversation with the other person? So describe a conflict that would fit in each of those three categories. That was a really long question, eh? And look at my Canadian come out there with the A at the end.
So, I mean, it's difficult because of course, in every workplace, and depending on the size of the employer, it's different. Depending on how fast paced things are, it differs. But if you have something that's ongoing, that is more than just today we had a conflict and I need to manage this between two coworkers that report to me. Two coworkers come to me and they're having a conflict, and it's something I can manage today and get fixed today, and we need to get it fixed today to move on with today, then I need to do it today, like
you need to manage it yourself.
Right. Yeah. Little things that you need to manage today, but there are things that blossom into long-term conflicts where, you are debating whether or not one of the team members might need to be let go, right? Then maybe you need to call somebody in, or, where your one team member is saying that they might quit over the other team member, you might need to bring somebody in, or you have a client or a customer that's complaining about this conflict, you might need to bring somebody in. With every industry and every business, and depending on your budget and depending on how things work, all those things influence your decision on whether absolutely you can bring somebody in or you don't. But
I agree. I feel like I want to just provide a bit of meat there. So I'm thinking, from what you're saying, I'm hearing that you as a leader, conflict is going to happen between your team members. That's almost inevitable. Right. So the little conflicts in the moment, you are responsible for managing. Absolutely. That's part of your leadership position, right? Tips between employees, if you don't feel that they've got the tools to do it themselves and you want to come in and help them have that conversation, absolutely. When it's time to call a mediator, it's when like you said, one of the person is thinking about quitting. B, I would add when you're starting to see an impact on the rest of the team, where these two individuals' conflict is now tainting all of the morale, is now impacting the entire team. That's when you need to bring someone to intervene. The last one that I would even say is definitely when you've started to see it impacting the team, that's when you absolutely need to take it that step further. Of course, budget needs to be considered. There are costs associated, but to that point, it's costing you a lot more by not bringing someone in. It's costing you a lot more by people not wanting to come to work because they don't want to have to face that person. It's costing you a lot more because the team members might start calling in sick as well because they don't want to be exposed to that negativity. It's costing you customers because people walking in can feel that tension.
Right.
Yeah. So think about these things when you are considering
making that decision.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And that's what I'm saying. Like if you're having customers and clients that are feeling the impact of this issue, and if you're feeling it, I mean, if it's stressing you out, if it's something that you're putting off because you don't want to deal with it because it stresses you, then you bring someone in, because that's impacting your productivity, it's impacting your mental health, it's impacting your well-being. Then that's the time that you bring in help, right? You bring in reinforcement, somebody who knows what they're doing and can sort this out for you, and probably take a huge load off of your shoulders in a relatively short period of time because they know what they're doing.
Okay, I like what you just said there, because I want to provide another kind of aha moment for our listeners. What's your average for conflict when you're coming in? How many sessions of mediation does it typically take to resolve it, to come to resolution? If you had to put it
usually one, right? Yeah,
Like
usually
one and
one.
three was my most complex, but
Right.
between one and three,
Yeah.
right? And when you think about it, that if you could go, that's 3 hours. Imagine the time it's costing you by not dealing
Right.
with it, right? Folks, if you are and have been feeling the impact of some tension between some of your team members, this reoccurring conflict, this reoccurring personality clash, mediation is your answer. You can actually bring in someone to help both parties understand the impact of their words, to help both parties understand what needs to happen in order for them to work together more productively and less stress like ridden.
Yeah.
This was really helpful and insightful. Unfortunately, we are at our time. So I want to ask you, Mandi, if you had one final tip, trick, strategy, nugget of wisdom to offer our listeners, what would that be?
To just remember that everybody that you work with is a whole person and nobody brings their whole person into the office. Even the people that you think are being completely authentic, there's still part of them that is outside of that, right? Everybody has something some layer to them that they're not showing you that impacts how they behave and how they perceive. So you never know. And that's how a mediator can help is they can dig in and they can find that layer and they can find that perception and they can find that key to unlock what needs to be nurtured, what needs to be fixed, what needs to be helped, and what puzzle pieces need to be put together to resolve the conflict that is occurring in your workplace and is affecting your productivity.
Absolutely. Your productivity, your bottom line at the end of the day. And sweeping it under the carpet or avoiding it will only make it grow bigger and bigger and be much more costly in the end. Thank you, Mandi, for joining us. If listeners want to continue to connect with you or want to reach out because they're interested in, hiring a mediator, how can they go about doing that?
Yeah, sure. So my phone number is 813-999-5071. I
Sure.
am reachable by email at mclay@milesadr.com. And you can also find me on LinkedIn, Mandi Clay. Just look me up on LinkedIn.
Fabulous. Folks, you got her direct number. That's a first. That's awesome. Listeners, as I say in every episode, I want you to listen to what you've heard today and reflect and think about one thing you can do, maybe in this case, to yourself. Have that more courageous conversation the next time, or even just to manage or address a reoccurring conflict within your workplace. One thing you can do to start doing it now, and then go do that. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, please like and share so that others can hear the wonderful wisdom that was imparted today.
Well, folks, thanks for joining us for yet another enriching conversation. To hear more about today's guests, make sure to check out the links in the description of this episode. Want to continue the conversation? Then head on over to our social media platforms, all of which are also linked in the description, to keep it going. Finally, don't forget to subscribe to make sure you don't miss another valuable episode.